Perhaps the most important feature from the previous video was the new heat pump. I actually never mentioned it, but it also needed some kind of a drainage system for the condensation, as well as a way to prevent that from freezing during the winter, which is why this interesting wire is here that basically gets just warm enough to melt ice if you plug it into the wall. The other really big thing from the previous video was this whole water system here. While it's not really being actively used yet, it still works, but there is this one big concern, which is that the temperature in the basement is starting to fall, and I really need to find a way to prevent the pipes from freezing when it gets really cold. But at least on the upside, the dread glue finally sealed the slight water leak that it previously still had. Also, I was looking around in the basement, and besides a bunch of tools, I also found this box full of old Christmas ornaments. The box is a bit moldy, but honestly, I would kinda like to use them for something. And under the decorations, I found a bunch of mirror tiles, and I'm not really sure what to do with all of them. And there's also this Molotov looking thing here for some reason as well. And finally, I also found another bucket full of rocks who were all really sleepy, but luckily when I brought them outside, they eventually woke up and hopped away. Anyway, these evergreen trees had their tops cropped off when a new cable was installed, as they had already grown way above the electrical line, and all of the tree tops were left over, and I wasn't really sure what to do with them, but I didn't really want to throw them away, so I decided to put them all into their own bucket of water to keep them alive. I think they look pretty nice, and I also put some by this wooden garage as well, which is slanted to the extent that it looks like it's about to fall over. Since the weather was starting to get really wet and cold, I decided that I should probably do something about all this scrap wood near the fence here before it rots away completely. There are also a bunch of big timber logs here, but I don't really have the tools to deal with them right now, and I also think they're pretty rotten regardless. I did borrow this electrical chainsaw though, and I decided to cut all of these planks into smaller pieces so I could use them as firewood. My cutting method wasn't the best at first though, because I didn't utilize the bumper spikes that can be used to push the saw into the wood better, so cutting these planks was actually much more difficult than I expected. I assumed the chainsaw also wasn't that powerful or sharp, as it still required quite a lot of force. Eventually, it started raining, and since this chainsaw is electrical, I decided to stop for the day and instead carry all the logs I had cut thus far away from the rain. I luckily did have a place to store them, as a few days before that I also cleaned up this entire staircase area, and I realized that the frame I carried away from the porch area in the last episode could instead be put here and be used as a firewood rack, which actually worked out perfectly. And those were all the logs I had cut thus far, and they fit into this rack quite nicely. There were still quite a lot of planks to go though, so a few days later I decided to finish the rest of them as well. It started getting a bit too dark for the camera, so I decided to stop recording and just finish the rest of the logs and once again carry them inside. I found another identical frame in the basement as well, so I carried it upstairs and used it for the same purpose. And those were pretty much all the logs from that pile, but there is still a ton of scrap wood all over the place here, so eventually I'll have to cut those as well, but hopefully I'll have enough firewood at least for this season. Anyway, I came here on the 24th of May, and for the entire time, I've been actually tethering 4G internet to my desktop through a USB cable, as this place doesn't have any internet. Luckily I have unlimited data, but my internet speed is only 10 megabytes per second down and 5 up, which is pretty awful when I have to upload a video that's over 20 gigabytes, but there really isn't much I can do about it. However, I randomly happened to check during August, and comes out that they're actually building an optical cable network here, which is quite the incredible coincidence in terms of timing. The infrastructure is still under construction, but I was already able to join, which cost me 200 euros, as they had to install a cable to the same pole that the storks live on, which is also why the trees had to be cut shorter earlier in the video. However, I still needed to provide a way for the cable to get from the pole to the abandoned store somehow, and since I really don't want some wire dangling in the air, the only other option I had was to dig an underground tunnel and get the cable inside the building that way. Which is what I actually did. However, I didn't record most of it, as I had to get it done as fast as possible because the deadline was coming, and at the time it already got dark at around 4 PM. Most of the dirt was luckily pretty diggable with a shovel and a hoe, but it was incredibly difficult to dig a trench into this road here, because not only was the ground already slightly frozen, but it was also completely full of gravel, meaning that it wasn't possible to dig it with a shovel, so I ended up grinding it out really painfully with some iron rod, a hoe, and a rake. But luckily, I was able to finish the entire tunnel before it got completely dark, and the crazy thing is that the moment I finished it, it started snowing quite heavily, and within less than an hour there was a thick coat of snow on the ground, which still hasn't melted to this day. It truly was pretty much the last possible moment for the cable to be installed this year. The pipe goes into the basement from this hole here, through which runs the optical cable, and now I just have a bunch of it that I can bring upstairs one day. But I'm not going to do that just yet though, as the infrastructure for the network is most likely not going to be finished before spring of 2023, meaning that I can't even use it regardless. Since the temperature had now dropped below freezing, I decided to close these windows, which were just completely buried in leaves. It was actually pretty hard to close them, as I assumed due to the moisture damage, they really didn't want to close properly anymore. The condensation from the heat pump also started freezing, so I thought it was probably a good idea to plug in the heating cable and see if it actually works. Anyway, in the first episode, one of the concerns I had was that the floors were really dusty, and at first I wanted to buy the cheapest flooring I could find, but I decided that it was a bit too early for that because I hadn't even painted the walls or anything, so in the end I decided to just apply some dustproofing primer instead. It worked pretty well, but of course it didn't make the floor 100% dustproof, and while I wouldn't really mind a nice concrete floor, it's pretty difficult to make it perfectly suitable for living, mixed with it having quite a lot of downsides as well, so once again I started thinking about installing some actual flooring. In preparation for that, the first thing I thought I should do was remove the styrofoam wall from the store frame, as the floor actually extends beyond it as well. Unfortunately, I had to remove it cleanly though, as it worked perfectly for covering the staircase that led to the basement instead. Having this area open is also nice because now I have some additional room, as well as an extra door leading directly outside. So now I would have liked to get started with the flooring, however, I quickly realized that it's not actually that simple. The walls have these styrofoam margins which will prevent the floor tiles from getting close enough to the wall, but even if I were to cut them to be level with the concrete floor, there are these wires here that would still be in the way, and it would actually also be a problem if I ever wanted to install some kitchen furniture here for the same reason. Meaning that every single one of these wires, as well as these kitchen pipes, had to be put inside the wall, which implied cutting a hole into the wall that then had to be filled and once again painted. But there was another, perhaps even a bigger issue, which is also why the floor suddenly had these weird patches of color on it. Came out that the concrete floor was actually really uneven in some places. For example, it had this water drain hole in the kitchen, so the floor was quite aggressively slanted down along with some other places, and since most modern floorboards allow for around a 2mm height deviation per meter, it meant that the concrete floor in its current state wasn't suitable for flooring, which was just really disheartening. But came out that there's this thing called self-leveling concrete, which is kinda just like really watery concrete that when poured on the ground will naturally just even itself out. I tried using that and the whole thing was just a tragedy. It was really messy and really hard to use and mix correctly, and if you do it wrong, it's going to end up being even worse than before, and you only have a very limited amount of time before the mixture becomes unusable or no longer self-leveling, which is why it wasn't the most pleasant experience. It also took multiple layers, meaning that I had to do the whole process multiple times, and even after it was done, the results usually still weren't perfect, and I had to grind down a lot of the areas that ended up being higher than before. But I guess it wasn't a tragedy of the maximum scale, because even though the results were pretty imperfect, it was still much better than before, though I was still completely uncertain if it was actually good enough. Unrelated, but I also tried restoring this wooden slat to cover the hole in the missing door frame, but even after spending quite a lot of time on it, I ended up not using it, at least for now. On another note, during the night I saw this animal running around the rooftops and tree branches. I think it's a pine marten, which is pretty epic as I've never seen this animal IRL before. For some reason, I've never really seen all that many forest animals in general, and suddenly even a deer was under my window and exploring around the yard. It was actually starting to get really cold. In fact, at one point it was minus 18 degrees Celsius. Luckily, the heat pump was still working, but it was probably using quite a lot of energy as it was pretty loud. The temperature in the basement was fortunately still slightly above freezing, but just to stay safe, I got some help and we moved this fireplace downstairs to this basement instead, and I also put the doors back to these frames, but unfortunately, due to the moisture damage, they also don't really close anymore. The fireplace actually worked really well down here. It was burning with a really loud fire and it got so hot that the chimney pipe itself started glowing red. And despite the room being pretty big, it actually made the room quite warm, meaning that I no longer had to worry about the water pipes freezing. You may be wondering though, if I move this fireplace to the basement, what's going to replace it in the actual room that I plan on living in one day? Well, to keep the really long story short, I think this time I'm going to do something a bit different and show you the final result of what the apartment actually looks like now. Hai! Kansei shimashita! The floor is finished and there's even a kitchen now with a fully functioning sink as well. Not to mention, there's also a brand new wood burning stove that even has a window. On warmer days, when I make a big fire here and refill it multiple times, it actually gets decently warm, anywhere from around 14 to 20 degrees Celsius with the heat pump set to 19 degrees. To be honest, I didn't really expect to replace the previous fireplace as I imagined that it was perfect for burning large pieces of scrap wood that I cut earlier in the video, but since the basement also needed a heating source mixed with a bunch of other problems that I list on the screen, the more sense it made that sooner or later I'd have to get a new fireplace here regardless. The new wood burning stove cost around 800 euros, but if you also account for the chimney pipe and so on, then the total cost was probably around 1000 euros. But honestly, I don't regret it as the stove is really nice as it doesn't let any smoke in, fits pretty large logs, and if I want to, I can also probably even cook something on top of it. As for the floor, it was quite a lot of work, but now it's pretty much all done without any issues. I actually bought the flooring already in early October, however it just took really long to install due to all the issues that had to be solved beforehand. I didn't record the process as it took multiple days, and I didn't do it alone either as I didn't have the tools nor the previous experience with installing any flooring, but comes out it's actually pretty simple. You just have to decide on some pattern and then cut the pieces to be the right sizes and hope you don't cut them the wrong way like I did in this clip. In total, the floor cost around 600 euros, but the unfortunate thing was that a lot of these floorboards were broken and unusable straight out of the box. Around 2 packs or 50 euros worth of tiles went to waste because of it. Next we have the kitchen, and I actually had it already in September before I even bought the flooring, but due to the concrete floor being so uneven and the wires being in the way, even the kitchen couldn't be installed, and it's probably better to install the flooring before the kitchen regardless, so I ended up buying the floor as well. Originally, instead of buying an entire kitchen, I actually just wanted to put a sink into some random kitchen countertop and call it a day, but it would have been a temporary solution, and even that would have had a cost of around 200 euros, excluding the sink and faucet, which cost around another 200. And considering that this IKEA kitchen furniture cost around 475, it made so much more sense just to invest into the final solution instead of something much less practical and temporary. One of the issues this kitchen has right now though is that the countertop isn't perfectly against the wall, and that's because comes out that this wall is just completely uneven, which I guess has to be fixed one day. Also, there is this one thing about the kitchen that I was really keen about, which is the kitchen sink. In my previous apartment, I had a medium-sized sink, and since I do the dishes by hand, I decided that if I ever were to buy a kitchen sink again, I'm going to get the biggest possible option available, and that's what I did here. One option was to get a sink which was the same size as this one, but just with a huge singular bowl, but I decided that it's probably better to have two separate bowls, as then I can put the dishes to dry somewhere as well. This sink is actually so big that it didn't even fit into this furniture without cutting some of the support beams a bit, but to be completely honest, I kinda wish it was even a bit bigger, or at least one of the bowls could be wider than the other, but both of them are still wider than the sink I have in my actual apartment, so it's probably already good enough. But I guess I'll find out if I actually move here one day. Speaking of moving in almost every episode I've been saying that this place is starting to feel livable, but now that it finally has a kitchen sink, it actually is completely livable. Meaning that in the next episode I'm most likely going to be moving in, and I think I'll save all the celebratory words until then, so